The Canon M50 was released back in 2018. Now, at the time, this cost around $800. Nowadays, you can find it used for about $400, and you can actually find it cheaper than that if you really shop around. So, just what do you get with this 4-year-old camera? Well, there's a 24.1 megapixel APS-C size sensor, Canon's genuinely quick dual-pixel autofocus, and a 3.2-inch 1.62 million dot fully articulating LCD screen. Build quality of the Canon M50 is admittedly kind of plasticky, but it's not all bad. You know, it's a really nice, sturdy, lightweight plastic. Plus, combined with how actually small this camera is, this is one of those cameras you can kind of just take with you wherever you go. It's not so small that it's pocketable, but it is so small that when you toss it into a camera bag, you barely even notice that it's there. Especially with something like this, the Canon 22mm f2.0, this takes up hardly any space at all. By the way, those first two clips were filmed on the Olympus EM1 Mark II. Everything from here on out is being filmed on the Canon M50 itself. I'll be jumping around through 3 different lenses. Like right now, what you're looking at is the Sigma 16mm f1.4. I'll also be using the Canon 22mm f2 and the Viltrox 56mm f1.4. So at any point of the video, if you're curious as to what I'm actually filming with, just glance right down there at the bottom of the screen and I'll have the lens listed. In terms of shutter speed, you've got up to 1/4000th of a second. Admittedly, it would have been nice to see about 1/8000th of a second, but this is still more of an entry-level camera. And in terms of flash sync speed, it goes up to 1/200th of a second. And in terms of burst rate, you've got 7.4 frames per second in autofocus continuous and full 10 frames per second in autofocus single. Now, fun piece of trivia with the Canon M50, up until this point, Canon had been using the CR2 file format. Canon M50 was the year that they introduced the CR3 file format. These shoot in Canon C-RAW or compressed RAW, which is actually 40% smaller than regular RAW files, so that's a pretty cool trade-off. You know, in the time that I've been using it, it seems to retain all the information that it would from regular RAW files. Like, I haven't noticed any type of significant difference. Overall, I've been enjoying it. I had to pause filming for a second. It was kind of raining the whole time that I was trying to film that, and then it just started legitimately raining. I'm sure you can hear it on the roof and the windshield of the car. We might have to take up this video again tomorrow. In terms of lens mount, the M50 is obviously a Canon M-mount, and that does kind of lead us to the elephant in the room, which is Canon was never really big on the M-mount back when they were actively making cameras and lenses for this system, and now with the R7, they've kind of showed that they're sort of moving in that direction, and lots of speculation as to whether the M-mount is completely dead or not. Having said that, there are still a lot of really good lenses for the M-mount, albeit many of them are third-party lenses. There's still some great lens options. Autofocus on the M50 is genuinely good. You know, you've got Canon's dual-pixel autofocus, and it's just so incredibly quick and accurate. You know, I'm filming this at 56mm at f1.4, and it just locks right in. It tracks my every single movement. You know, I can kind of just move around, I can walk forward, I can walk back, and it still just tracks me the entire time. I mean, I can come up close and I can see I'm in focus right there. Now, let me take a few steps back to where I was, and it just locks in. It just finds me. Now, in terms of video, you've got 4K at 24 frames per second and 1080p at 24, 30, and 60 frames per second. You do have a slow motion option of 120 frames per second, although it is at 720p. Now, the biggest bummer about 4K on the M50 is, one, there's a 1.7 times crop, so if your normal field of view is this big, the second you switch to 4K, it just sort of shrinks down to like this big. No, the biggest point of contention with 4K on the M50 is the fact that it doesn't have dual pixel autofocus. You have some of the best autofocus in the world and some of the other resolutions, and then the second you get to 4K, it switches to contrast detect only, and not trying to be funny, but it's literally Panasonic bad. You know, when you're in 4K, the autofocus just kind of meanders, kind of hunts, kind of drifts. Sometimes it'll film you, sometimes it just goes right to the background, sometimes it just never sees that a subject was there in the first place, which is crazy because when you're in 1080p, the autofocus is just so good on this camera. I guess that's why for me personally, every time I use the M50, I'm just using it in 1080p. Having said that though, the 1080p footage does look really, really good. And also, that's 60p. I film so much B-roll on this camera in 1080p, 60 frames per second. It's not as slow, obviously, as 120 frames per second, but it is slow and it does look really good. Now, in terms of photography, the M50 is a really capable little camera. You know, you've got that 24.1 megapixel APS-C size sensor, and there's a great deal of resolution there. You know, images coming from this camera look genuinely good. Not to mention, you've got a more modern, updated version of Canon color science, and I like the colors that just come straight out of this camera. You know, it's a good look. However, I would say the biggest downside on the M50 in terms of photography, and it's a lot of Canon cameras actually, is dynamic range. When you have a really contrasty subject, you're either exposing for the sky or for the person in the shadows. It's not a whole lot of in between. You know, especially if you're just shooting JPEGs and you're not really editing your images. If you're exposing for the person in the picture, then you're just gonna end up with a bright white sky in the background. Otherwise, if you expose for the sky in the background, you're just going to end up with a person that's completely in the shadows. Having said that, I still really like the images that come from the Canon M50.
Can't I just die here on the beach with my fingers in the sand and the water at my feet? Can I just get some release here? Everybody falls off the tippy of they tall talk, don't come and talk to me. I ain't trying to see fear reflections in my rear view, deflectors in my purview coming after me. Got some issues with my worldview, I iron out the kinks. I ain't trying to be king, crowns ain't the way to bring love. Soft touch, hard hands lead to backwards endeavors. These mans really think they worth can be summed up in a measure.
Another one of the reasons the M50 has gotten so popular in recent years is for people looking for a camera for YouTube. And as someone who's been using the M50 for YouTube for a few years, I can attest, yeah, it does make a great YouTube camera. You know, you've got the frustration with the bad autofocus in 4K, but other than that, this camera literally does every single thing that I need for filming a YouTube video. You know, you've got incredibly accurate autofocus, you've got 1080p that looks genuinely good, you've got 60p so I'm able to film slow motion B-roll, you've got a mic input so that I'm able to sit way over here and you can still actually hear what I'm saying, and on top of all that, you've got that articulating screen, which is so incredibly necessary. You know, I'm filming this on a 56mm lens. That camera is all the way across the parking lot. I need that articulating screen to be able to see if I'm actually even in the shot, if I'm in frame. It would have been nice to see better 4K on this camera, but beyond that, the M50 really does do everything that I need for filming a YouTube video. So that brings us to the obvious question, is the M50 worth it in 2022? And I would say yes, and probably now more than ever. See, the M50 has always been a really solid hybrid camera that just does everything that you need, and it does it well. You know, you've got great photos, you've got great video, but the price was always hovering around $500 for a used M50. You know, at the time that I got mine, I ended up buying it new because it was $600 new on Amazon, and then around $500 to $550 used on eBay. So it didn't really make any sense to buy it used. But now, for the first time in the history of this camera, used prices of the M50 have come down so far that it's almost crazy to not buy an M50 right now. You know, like I showed you at the top of the video, there's that one M50 listed currently for $250. I mean, that's absolutely insane. And then you've got those other ones right in like the $300 to $400 price range. That's a genuinely good price for this camera. You know, and for someone like me who's been using this camera for the past few years for YouTube videos, I was happy with this camera when it cost $600. You know, the fact that you can now get this camera for around $300 or $400 is absolutely insane. For someone like me who's a camera collector and is constantly always looking for new cameras for this channel, I do a lot of shopping for cameras all day, every day, and you never really find good hybrid cameras in this kind of price range. Like, for example, the average Sony camera right now selling used is still selling for around $700, $800, $900, even like $1,000. You know, and everyone just kind of blames the chip shortage, but still, those cameras are going for those prices used. The point being, when you're looking in that $300 to $400 price range, you're not usually finding a really solid hybrid camera like this. You know, at $300 or $400, it's like you could get a Sony a6000, but there's no mic input and there's no articulating screen. You know, there's always just little things like that for if you're kind of looking for a camera that does everything, you're always a little bit disappointed. You know, and so if you want cameras that do everything, you usually have to start creeping up into the $600 or higher price range. That's what I'm trying to emphasize here. The fact that the M50 is selling for around $350, $400. If you have ever been interested in this camera, now is the time to get a Canon M50. Anyway, I think that's all I got for today, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.